I was planning a move to a new city where my cousin Jeremy lived. I took a long weekend trip there to figure it all out. I had originally planned to stay with Jeremy, but his wife's whole family decided they wanted to visit me at the same time, so I ended up staying at the Hilton Hotel instead. It wasn't a big deal. Money wasn't an issue for me. My main problem was the lack of a decent female society. I seemed to be attracted to all the wrong types of women, which usually resulted in either anger, frustration, misunderstanding, or heartbreak on my part. Since Jeremy didn't like spending too much time with his wife's family, he and I spent a lot of time with his wife's family. While I looked for places to live and set up my law practice, we hung around together. My practice is such that I rarely have to meet with clients in person, so I can live and work anywhere where I am a member of the state bar. On Saturday night, Jeremy and I went to a party thrown by one of Tom bearing the party, one of Jeremy's business partners, threw a party in his basement. It was typical for people in their 30s, except that he had a large dance floor. There were a few single ladies there, and I'm a decent dancer, so I was very busy. However, there was one thing that was unclear. Tom's wife, Susan, seemed to be something between a maid and a quiet woman. She didn't seem to have anyone to talk to much, and was mostly working, making sure all the drinks were available. She also seemed to put up with a lot from Tom, who I immediately disliked. I noticed Susan primarily because she was wearing a nice dress, nothing fancy, just cute. While most of the other women were wearing jeans or shorts, Susan's face was lovely, and her body was attractive, but she wasn't the most glamorous woman I'd ever seen. She was definitely a keeper, though. I found myself thinking about her getting out of bed, which confused me because I didn't like thinking about women in that way, especially married ones. Finally, when there was a short break in my dance card, I noticed that Susan went to the kitchen for more snacks. I was introduced to her when we got to the venue, and she said the only thing I really heard her say all evening was hello. I followed her into the kitchen and said, "Susan, it looks like you're working too hard and not having fun. Can I help you with anything?" In case you don't remember from our brief acquaintance, my name is Connor. She looked at me, not just into my eyes. Her eyes were dark, almost black. Before answering, she thanked me. Then she began to wash the glasses in the sink and asked, "Can you wipe them?" I took a kitchen towel and started drying. I tried to engage her in conversation. She answered my questions, but her responses were brief. They were not unfriendly, just very brief. Her responses to statements were usually just a head nod or a smile. Rarely did she use words. After we washed all the glasses, I helped her put a few more snacks on plates. Then I took half the plates and glasses to the dance floor. A little later, I asked her to dance. She refused. Tom doesn't like it when I dance. That was probably the longest sentence she said that evening. I led her to the dance floor anyway. She was an athletic dancer and seemed to enjoy it. But at the beginning of our second dance, Tom walked up to her and ordered her to get him something. She shrugged. I was pretty mad, and if he hadn't been the owner and one of Jeremy's colleagues, I would have stepped in at some point. I found Susan alone in the kitchen again, so I turned her towards me and asked why she lets Tom treat her like that. She's a great woman. She shouldn't let him treat her harshly. She smiled. She simply answered, "It's difficult. Could you help again?" I completed one more task for her and then she came to me. "Where did you stop?" she asked, starting a conversation with me and everyone else at the Hilton on Grand Street. "How did you know that?" "I was just visiting. Jeremy introduced you," and she smiled. Then she asked another question. "Does your room have a view of the lake?" "Yes, it has a wonderful view, so the number is even on what floor this is. Room 810. You must be familiar with the Hilton Hotel." I answered with a smile. She smiled back and then went off to do something else. As Jeremy and I were leaving, I said goodbye to Susan. Tom was drunk at the time and wasn't likely to remember what I said to him, so instead of thanking me, I simply muttered, "You're an—" I think Susan heard me, or at least that's what made her smile. Jeremy and I went to a local hangout. I played some pool and then went to my hotel. I'd taken a shower and was only in my underwear, getting ready to go to bed, when there was a knock on my door. I looked through the peephole, but all I could see was what looked like a woman's hair. I opened the door a crack and was shocked to see Susan. Susan was wearing a cloak. When I asked her why she was there, she didn't say anything. Instead, she opened her cloak, revealing a very beautiful naked body. It was much more beautiful than it looked when she was dressed. While I was in a stupor, she simply walked past me. By the time I closed the door, she was gone. My mouth was wide open, although my eyes remained open. She was wearing nothing but high heels. She grabbed me by the neck, kissed me, and slid one hand into my boxers. It was the strangest sexual experience of my life, as far as I remember. There wasn't a word spoken. There was a lot of moaning, squealing, and excited exclamations, but no real words. Susan was the most uninhibited and energetic sexual partner I've ever had, or even dreamed of. When we reached the finish line and stopped moving, we were completely empty. We somehow separated our connecting parts, and given the time of day and how intense our encounter was, we either fell asleep or passed out at some point. When I felt movement in my groin, I looked down and saw Susan. We had another intense sexual experience, and I soon released the second heaviest weight of my life. We both collapsed onto the mattress I was on. I was in a daze. I didn't realize it at the time, but it seemed like Susan had got up, put her coat back on, and left. I felt cold lying on the bed. I eventually crawled under the covers and fell into a deep sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I was sure it was just a dream. The only thing that convinced me it was real was that there was a note. The note was written in lipstick on the dressing table and said thank you. I couldn't remember if Susan had spoken at all during our meeting the previous evening. I couldn't remember her saying anything, but if her actions were words, they could fill a book as big as Tolstoy's War and Peace. The next day I was pretty out of it. Jeremy and I looked at a few houses and offices together, but I was really not up for it. He must have asked me half a dozen times what was wrong with me. I came up with some excuse about having a hangover, even though I probably only had 2 beers. I'd had a few beers the night before, and in reality I had a hangover, a sexual hangover. On my way home on Monday morning, I couldn't stop thinking about my sexual encounter with Silent Susan. I'd dated at least a dozen women who were better looking than Susan, but sex with her was light year better than any other sex I'd ever had. I should have felt sad and guilty about having sex with a married woman, something I'd never done before, and intellectually and morally despised. Instead, I felt excited for the next month, preparing for the move. I was emotionally exhausted, except when I was working or exercising intensely. I thought about it took me a month after I moved to pull myself together and start looking for a sorority in my new city. I made it a rule never to pass by Susan's house or try to contact her. I really liked my new city after about 3 months of being there. I was making even more money than before. I made several friends, both male and female. I've been on a few dates, but nothing that really stood out. It was almost 3 months into my new home when I went to a party at Jeremy's house without my date. I was having a pretty good time when Tom and Susan walked in. Susan, my thoughts immediately went back to my amazing experience in room 810 of the local Hilton Hotel. She looked exactly the same as she did at her party, although the dress was a different color, and her hair was more elaborate. I waited until Tom had a couple of sips of strong liquor, and as Susan stood alone, I went over to her at the side of Jeremy's small dance floor and said hello. Susan, I smiled. "Hi, Connor," she replied with a smile. "Don't you want to dance?" I asked, holding out my hand. She simply nodded her head, so I said, yes, smiled and took my hand. We actually danced until we dropped. Susan was less uptight than at her party, because she didn't have to worry about keeping the snacks and drinks fresh. She was even more energetic a dancer than I remembered. After about 45 minutes of fast dancing in a row, we were both very sweaty. I said, "Let's take a break." She said, "What would you like to drink?" I said, "Soda." She stayed where she was until I brought her a glass. I got her a glass, which made her really happy. I asked, "Does Tom ever bring you drinks?" "I don't know," she replied, sipping her beer. "I'll have to ask him." After some more chatting, I laughed and said, "You're not very talkative, are you?" She smiled and said, "No, I'm not." She was pretty quiet, wasn't she? She smiled a lot. For some men, it's a dream not to be around a chatty woman. I believe in actions, not words. We danced some more, and I took her along to talk to different people at the park. She seemed pleased to be included in the conversation. Although she still didn't say much, as the party began to end, she excused herself and went to look for Tom. I was about to leave when she came up to me and asked, "Can you help me with Tom?" He'd passed out, of course. I smiled. I found Tom passed out on a glider on Jeremy's porch. I never mentioned my size before, but I'm big and fit enough that I could easily throw his roughly 80 kilos over my shoulder. Walked to his car and put him in the back seat. Susan asked, "Could you please follow me home and take it to our house?" I smiled and said, "No problem." Getting a dead-drunk Tom out of the back seat was harder than getting him out of a party at Jeremy's. I asked Susan where she wanted to put it. She said the master bedroom on the second floor. She opened the doors for me on the way. As soon as I laid him on the bed, she and I left the bedroom and closed the door. After about 2 minutes of passionate kissing, she said shower. I truly believe that the word shower was the only real word she spoke for the next 90 minutes. She made a lot of sounds after we had sex for the second time. I was sitting on the bed in her guest room, and she looked at me. I was practically comatose when I reached the finish line. She followed me and screamed in ecstasy. In the end, we rested and lay side by side, lazily caressing. After a delightful period of joyful stupor, she said, "Tom sometimes wakes up after 2 hours of sleep. It's probably time for you to go." That was the most I had ever heard from her since I met her. After I got dressed and we kissed goodbye, she said, "If you want me to stay I'll be at your house on Wednesday evening. Give me your address, since the sex this time was even better than the first time." I answered 902 Chardonnay Court after another quick kiss. I walked out the door, not entirely sure that Susan would show up at my house on Wednesday. If she did, I wanted to make a good impression, so I cleaned my house and put new sheets on my bed on Tuesday. When I pulled up to my house around 5:30 on Wednesday, Susan was standing on my porch. When I got home, she was waiting for me with a big smile on her face. She gave me a short but passionate kiss. I thought I'd order something Chinese for delivery after we ate dessert. She laughed. Dessert was her latest attempt to get me in bed. We exchanged caresses in post-coital bliss. She ordered Chinese. She called, then speed-dialed the number and ordered exactly what I wanted. I wondered how she knew what. I wanted Susan to pay the delivery guy for the food, and I delivered the refreshments. She confirmed my suspicions that she did not drink alcohol. She said she was worried about losing her head. I laughed to myself. What do you think? If not, she showed up in my hotel room to have sex and then had sex in your house with your husband in the next room after dinner. I invited her to watch a Netflix movie so our food had a chance to digest. As usual, she didn't say much in response. It was clear she was pleased. She was touched when we hugged while watching the movie. When it ended, she gave me another passionate kiss and quickly undressed after a shower. It was another great round of sex, with some talking in bed where she answered questions with body language. We fell asleep in each other's arms. I woke up sometime early in the morning. My alarm clock said something like 3:30 a.m. Morning. We had another round, and it was really nice. It seemed like she enjoyed it too. When I woke up, Susan wasn't next to me, but her clothes and small purse were still in my room, so I assumed she hadn't left. The smell of bacon woke me up when I walked into the kitchen. Susan looked up from her notepad. She was writing in and smiled. "I can make you an omelet," she said, straightening up with her naked body and kissing me again. "I'll help," I replied, kissing her again. We cooked a cheese omelet together. I asked her a few harmless questions with her typical short answers until I asked, "What did you write in your notebook?" "I was just doing some calculations for a modification," she replied. She replied while flipping our omelet with her wrist, "To the advanced BWXT nuclear reactor I'm working on." "What did you say?" I laughed. She repeated what she had just said after the second time. I was still puzzled. "Why would you do that?" I asked. "No matter what you say, you're doing." She transferred the omelet from the frying pan to 2 different plates using a spatula. "Spatula, this is part of my job. I'm a nuclear engineer." I thought she was joking at first, but I didn't laugh. I asked where she studied after eating a few slices of bacon and half an omelet. By the time we'd finished, I realized she was a genius. She was only 27 and had already got a doctorate in nuclear science and engineering from MIT and worked in the field for 6 years. In fact, she didn't stop talking about her job for 20 minutes while we finished breakfast. Breakfast washed the pans of bacon and scrambled eggs together and put our plates and cutlery in the dishwasher. In the end, she concluded, "Well, that's what I do in a nutshell." I understood about 110% of what she said, but it was clear that she was a freaking genius. Kissing her in the kitchen, I asked rhetorically, "So you're a genius? With her help, I'm becoming as she was a genius at sex. She grinned back, and then insisted on one more time in bed before we both left for work for the next 4 months. I typically met with Susan twice a week for sex. She was always mostly silent unless we somehow broached the topic of nuclear fission or fusion. Susan then turned into a talker. Having Susan drive me unconscious twice a week made me a sexually happy guy, so I had a few other dates, but during one of her sleepovers at my house when Tom was out of town, I looked at her sleeping after another amazing sexual encounter. I noticed a few bruises on some parts of her body and wondered if Tom had hurt her. I became suspicious because when I asked her about Tom's physical abuse of her in the past, she never gave a real answer. I suddenly admitted. I realized I had feelings for her. I also came to the conclusion that I was an idiot for having sex with a married woman. I didn't sleep much that Monday night into Tuesday morning, mostly staring at the ceiling holding Susan close to me. Although we were still going to have sex in the morning, I decided I had to do something. Susan surprised me at breakfast when she seemed to read my mind. "Don't you think you should invite me to live with you, Connor?" she asked. It was the longest sentence she had ever spoken in front of me that wasn't about her work. "You're married," I answered. "You have to get me out of." This was her quick response, and then she kissed me and ran out the door. I spent all my free time from work on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday thinking about Susan. I tried to call her on her cell phone, but the call went to voicemail, and she didn't call back on Thursday evening. 3 men and 1 woman unexpectedly came to me in suits. One guy, Arnold, introduced himself as Susan's boss. Another, Patrick, was from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in Rockville, Maryland. A third guy, Agent Stahl, was an FBI agent, and the woman, ASDD, was a family law attorney. We were there to talk about Susan. Arnold said, "Can we come in?" "Of course," I replied, leading them into my living room and offering them drinks, which they all refused. Let me get straight to the point. Arnold said, "As you may know, Susan is a genius and is very important to our project to design a nuclear reactor that avoids most of the problems of the existing BWR and PWR nuclear reactors." I was proud that from my conversations with Susan I actually knew what BWR and PWR were. I really knew that I needed to help her. "Well, we need you to save Susan right now. She is at Mercy Hospital. She was beaten by her husband. He's been arrested, but he won't be released on bail. I was hired by Susan to file for divorce, which I'll do tomorrow. Astrid, could you help me with that? I asked Susan if she wanted to stay with you while she recovers. My company will pay for help during the day, and you can take responsibility at night. She's not helpless, just broken." Then Arnold shocked me. "I'm afraid that my company is largely responsible for Susan's predicament. Susan had never had any sexual. We didn't get in touch with her before she started working with us. She was quite quiet and shy, and she was always the youngest student in her class throughout her training. She started showing signs of depression, and she was so valuable to us that we arranged for Tom Baer to look after her. The people who vouched for Tom I didn't know very well, and I didn't really know him or have Susan's best interests at heart. I actually saw a tear in Arnold's eye, and Patrick patted him. He said that Susan only agreed to marry Tom because he was the first guy to show real interest in her and she was single. As you can see, things didn't work out with Tom, but she lights up like a Christmas tree every time she talks about you. She said that your approach to sex is different from the way it was with Tom, the only person she's had sex with. If you have any feelings for her, we ask you to accept her to see whether a long-term agreement will work. She says that in the less than a year that she's known you, she's had more sex with you than in the entire 3+ years of her marriage to Tom. I was pretty shocked at the time, given how enthusiastic and joyful she was about it. I'd assumed she was experienced, but I was told that she wasn't like that before we met, and that she had real feelings for me while I was still trying to process what Arnold Patrick started telling me how valuable Susan was to the nuclear community. But I interrupted him. "I don't need a sales pitch, Patrick. I was trying to decide whether to break up with Susan because she's married or convince her to get rid of that. Tom, the current circumstances are forcing me to commit to her. I'll go see her. I'll be in the hospital for a while, Arnold. I'll call you when I've made up my mind." Everyone around was smiling. "Do you mind if we look around your house to see where we could put a hospital bed for Susan and what rooms need to be equipped for nursing care?" "No, go right now." I smiled, taking the keys off the hook in the kitchen where I keep them. Just make sure the front door is locked when you leave." I shook hands with all four of them and then got into my car and drove to the hospital. Susan's private room was guarded by a policeman, but he quickly determined that I was allowed to see her. So I walked past him without any problem. I was stunned by her condition. She had 2 black eyes and other marks on her face and neck. One leg was twisted and one arm was in a cast. Even though her eyes were closed, they immediately opened. When I stroked her cheek, even though it seemed like it was painful for her to have me do it. She smiled when she saw me. "Do you only need me for sex, Connor?" she asked. Her smile turned into concern. "No. Although sex with you is the best of my life, I love being around you, Susan. Maybe I'm even in love with you." "I'm in love with you, Connor. You treat me much better than any other man, including my male relatives. Besides, I was never very sensual before I met you. Now I think about sex with you at least once an hour during the day. Would you let me live with you for a while if in a couple of months you don't want me around anymore? I'll leave without any hassle." "That would be great." I grinned and kissed her very tenderly on the lips. Her smile lit up the room. We then went on to have a long discussion about our goals in life, our views on children, our backgrounds, and much more. Susan was no longer silent. The nurse finally sent me away, saying that Susan needed to get some sleep. After my first visit to the hospital, things moved quickly from a dead point. Susan was discharged 3 days later into my care. She signed a document prepared by her lawyer that made me more or less her guardian until she was better, with access to her finances if I needed them, which I didn't. I ended up enjoying caring for Susan as she recovered. I think it was partly because as soon as the day nurses had left, we started touching each other. After about a week, one of her legs no longer hurt, and the bruises had healed enough for us to have sex as long as we were careful, so that's what we did as often as possible. Susan was a full-time outpatient within 3 weeks of coming to my home. We got rid of the hospital bed and fired the day nurses, and she went back to work part-time. One Saturday afternoon, about 5 months after Susan had recovered, we were enjoying almost constant body contact. She had made a lot of progress, but she still didn't speak much. She liked to chat with me, so she plopped down on my lap and said, "Connor, we need to talk. I want to tell you that I am a nymphomaniac." "Are you a nymphomaniac?" I faked a gasp, so that's why my manhood always hurts. "Connor," she said, lightly slapping me on the shoulder. "Bad boy. Okay, now listen. My divorce is next week and I want your children. What are you going to do about it?" I said, stroking my chin. "Will I be able to have sex with you? If we get married more often, because I won't hold back anymore." She chuckled. "You mean you were holding back?" I pretended to gasp again. "I'm not sure I can do more." "You'll learn." She grinned. "Fine. Will I still be able to have you when you're pregnant? Perhaps even more. I have a feeling that, unlike many pregnant women, she laughed. "So, you plan to love me to my early death?" I giggled. "Not to the grave. Just a constant euphoria." "Okay," I said after a long pause. "Let's get married so I can throw away my birth control pills on our anniversary." She laughed. "Here's what we did. We got married. Our first child was born on our 2-year anniversary. By the time our second child was born, just before our 4th anniversary, I was getting tired. Susan was always demanding sex during pregnancy, which was tiring for me. But we were happy. Then, at some point, 2 dogs appeared in our lives. Susan also got a $400 bonus. Susan got a bonus when she finished developing an advanced nuclear reactor. It worked even better than anyone thought it would, with 3 kids, 2 dogs, a husband who wanted to her every chance he got, and a full-time, part-time job as a nuclear engineer. Susan was no longer quiet. She was a chatty cat.